Professor Bullock is going to be our first speaker. He's at Columbia University, and he has 3 degrees from Harvard. And would you please come up and we'll let you start. As I said, I'm going to be very succinct and laconic with respect to the introduction. This guy is famous. We're lucky to have him. We want to focus on what he has to say and some Q&A opportunities.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be invited to speak at this event. Is there a breakthrough on the horizon for U.S. and Iran direct talks? I have no idea. And so thank you very much. If you invite a historian, you can't be surprised when you get a history lesson. So I'm going to talk a bit about history. People often ponder the question of whether history moves faster in our times than it has in the past. And most people will say yes, because they'll say, well, planes go faster, and instantaneous communication and so forth. And I take the opposite view. I say if there is a measure of history that you can have that is a constant measure, it's the human lifespan. Because you may be able to go from, LA to Tehran in just a few hours, actually more than a few. But those hours are every bit as long, and your lifetime is the measure. And this is important because in historical change, what really is important to look at is the cycling through of generations. There are people who are socialized or politicized or otherwise drawn into a particular historical nexus, come to the end of their careers. And they are succeeded by other people who did not have those same experiences. I'm very interested in the question of comparative revolutions and what happens with the revolution, with the passage of time. And one of the things that I am struck by is that when you get to the time when the revolutionary generation is at retirement age, things will change. And frequently, the people who are at retirement age will do their damnedest to keep them from changing. But they're going to change anyway, because the people who are coming next don't share that background. So now we have an Islamic Republic of Iran. It is basically 35 years old. Between now and when it is 40, we're going to see a very significant turnover of personalities, of people who are considered to be players as opposed to people who are thought of as men of the past generation. Some things we already know are going to be important, such as the demographic bulge that has produced a very, very large youth generation in Iran, which will not be a youth generation in 10 years. It will be a takeover generation. We already know that the majority of the university students in Iran are female, and that Iran has a higher level of female literacy than many countries in the Arab world, because unexpectedly, the policies of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is notoriously misogynistic in most readings, have created the basis for a great expansion of the talents, of the opportunities for women in Iran. It would be naive to think that the youth generation and the shift in gender significance will not play an important role. But the question is, who will negotiate that role, and how will that be manifested in institutional and policy terms. And that, of course, has to do with the turnover of the gatekeepers, the elites, the people who are at the top of the political and institutional apparatus. It is often, I have heard many criticisms of the Islamic Republic of Iran over the last 35 years, as all of you have. I have consistently, since before the revolution began, considered the Iranian religious political experiment to be one of the great experiments of modern times. One of the ones that will have elements of success, elements of failure, but cannot be ignored because it is an experiment that ran from the very beginning counter to what political scientists and sociologists had assumed would be the nature of revolutions. They had assumed that revolutions would be what they called progressive. They had assumed that revolutions would be secular. It turned out it didn't happen that way, or at least not in the way that was anticipated. I would argue that, in fact, elements that are or can be progressive, such as changes in gender roles and so forth, are there in the Islamic Republic. And I also think that it is clear that there is a current of secularization going on in the Islamic Republic. But given the kind of a time warp between the dominant figures and the people who are going to make the changes over the next 5 to 15 years, we don't yet see exactly how this is going to work out. This is normal. This is what happens in revolutions. So let me talk to you a bit about what happened 35 years after the beginning of the American Republic. George Washington becomes president in 1789. So you go 35 years, and you have the election of 1824. And the election of 1824 was considered by many people at the time to be a stolen election where devious backroom deals prevented the rightful man from becoming president and put the wrong man in his place because of a rigged vote. Now, we never talk about this because this is the era of the founding fathers. We idolize the founding fathers. We think that they must have been wonderful, wonderful political figures. In fact, they were really marginally competent in many ways. So what happened in 1824? You had basically 5 people who were eligible, that is to say, who had been identified by caucuses within the Congress to be candidates for president. You didn't have parties. All these people ran the same party. You didn't have primaries. You didn't have conventions. You simply had a caucus within the Congress to decide who should run for president. That caucus, I think they called the Guardian Council. No, maybe they called it something else. It's just a bad recollection on my part. But the thing is, it wasn't a system where there would be sort of grassroots organizations that would choose the person who should run for president. It was all set up internally. So you had 5 people. You had John Quincy Adams, who thought he deserved it because his father had been president. You had Andrew Jackson, the hero of War of 1812. You had Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and William Crawford. Now, who remembers William Crawford? But normally, the candidates for president at that time were cabinet members, and Crawford was a member of the cabinet. And that's what brought them to the attention of the congressional caucuses because every cabinet ministry had a corresponding role to play in the Congress, as opposed to the president, who had almost no connection with Congress at all. Presidents did not give speeches to Congress, they did not present legislation. They sat in the White House, and the road from the Capitol to the White House was virtually untrodden. Of course, it was a swamp, but that's the second point. So you had these guys who had their cliques in Congress who pushed them for the nomination. John C. Calhoun realized that he didn't have a chance. So he withdrew, and he became the vice presidential running mate of two of the other candidates. He was running on two tickets, or two tickets, so to speak. It was only one party. So then you had the vote. The vote was won by Andrew Jackson. He had a plurality of 41%. John Quincy Adams had 39%. And then you had smaller numbers, much smaller numbers, for William Crawford and the other one.
Henry Clay.
Henry Clay, right. So, the 12th Amendment to the Constitution has specified that if you have a failure in the Electoral College to get a majority, then they must vote again among the top three finishers. So that meant that three people, Crawford, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson, were going to be the finalists, which left Henry Clay out of the running, although he had substantial support. So then what happens is that Henry Clay's people go to support John Quincy Adams, and promptly John Quincy Adams, after being elected, names Henry Clay as Secretary of State. And this was seen by the Jackson people as a deal. It was simply a blatant theft of the election. Jackson should have won. He had carried half the states, whereas John Quincy Adams had carried only a third of the states. And so it was a stolen election. And Andrew Jackson was extremely irate and talked about this great scandal. Well, over time, as we all know, our presidential nomination and electoral system became perfect. And we no longer had stolen elections or irregularly nominated candidates or backroom deals or special log-rolling arrangements between potential candidates who would turn over their supporters to someone else. Well, we got rid of all that. But there at the beginning, 35 years after the founding, our system was not a perfect democracy. When we look forward to a presidential election in Iran, it would be foolish to think that you're going to get a perfect democracy in Iran. You know, if the Islamic Republic lasts long enough, say lasts as long as our democracy has, then it will become perfect. We know that that's what history dictates. But things are still in an early stage in terms of the evolution of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the anger or anxiety you see so often expressed by Americans and other observers about how the Iranian system is not truly democratic, not perfect, maybe it's rigged, or even worse, maybe it's not rigged, and so forth. That's normal for a polity at the stage of development that the IRI is at, and it was normal for our republic. In fact, to make a comparison, the IRI probably works better than the United States of America did, say between the end of Thomas Jefferson's administration and the end of John Quincy Adams' administration, which was a period of sort of desolate political leadership in the United States. So I think that people who have a rather short time horizon, looking back or looking forward, often leap to conclusions, rush to judgment, and say things are going to happen in a certain way when they aren't. What's going to happen is something that we cannot predict exactly, but what is going to happen is that over the next few years, we're going to see a turnover of people. And those people are the people who will be involved in direct Iran-US talks, if those should gradually be achieved. How would that look from a US perspective? I mean, from an Iranian perspective, obviously some people see a greater desirability to have such talks than others do. But we have a lot of misinterpretation, I think, of the American perspective. Keep in mind, no one under the age of 45 remembers Ayatollah Khomeini. No one in that age category, which includes all of our high school and college students and graduate students, assistant professors, nobody actually remembers the hostage crisis. Nobody remembers the Shah of Iran. It's all history for them. And the one thing I know after 45 years of teaching history is that students don't learn anything. And therefore, if it's history, they probably don't learn it. So what is Iran for these Americans who, over the next 5 to 10 years, will become our takeover generation? Iran is an anti-Israeli state. Iran is a country with nuclear ambitions. Iran is a country whose current president is considered kind of a make-fun-of figure for many Americans. Is Iran seen as a threat to the United States? I don't think it is. I think that the rhetoric surrounding the nuclear and Israel issues has created an illusion that some people buy into and other people do not. And the reason I say this, a year or two ago, a CNN reporter came to my office to do a little television interview, a real quickie, and said, okay, set up, stand there, and there's cameras on. How much of a danger is Iran to the United States? I said, 0. Iran's not a danger to the United States. And she started not pleasant. No, that's not an answer I can have. I need to know how much. I said, yes, you need to know that the answer is 0. It may be a threat to somebody. That's not a threat to the United States. And you should not be telling people that. So the effort to portray Iran in this way, I think, is there. I think it is not selling terribly well. That's the reason I think that we have a popular mood that would be willing to entertain direct talks. Well, what could be done to help? One thing is a peculiarity about Persian language. If you want to say, down with something, you say, married bad something. Married bad America, death to America. Married bad Israel, death to Israel. Married bad or bad hijabi, death to the woman who's letting her hair show because she wears a bad hijab. And so you say, well, why don't they say down with instead of death to? Oh, today I was asking a really brilliant specialist, an Iranian specialist on Iranian language, literature, history, and said, how do you say down with in Persian? What's the alternative to death to? He said, you can't. it's kind of death to or nothing. It's what you say. And then my friend who was at the table, who's a specialist in Turkey, was saying, I don't think we can say down with in Turkish. And it was pointed out that during the revolution, when people were saying, Mad Bar America, death to America, you had posters in English that were saying, down with America. Because that's what it means. And yet, one of the peculiar things that Americans associate with Iran is big crowds of people saying death to America. I think, well, supposing you had big crowds of Americans saying death to Iran, that would be a sea change in world politics. Because we have the alternative, we could say down with. And I think one of the things I'd like to see is candidates for president in the upcoming election in Iran to say that they will declare a moratorium on anyone in an official position saying Mad Bar America. It's time to get rid of the idea that death to is a acceptable locution in international affairs, particularly between countries that have as much in common and as much, as many important things to talk about as Iran and the United States. And what I think is the case is that the Iranian officialdom doesn't realize, because they think they're saying down with. And it's translated by CNN and others, Fox News, as death to. So, it's an atmospheric thing, but I think that atmospherics count at this particular juncture, where there is a possibility of movement, but you need to have something that becomes visible and means something, even if it's meaningless. And I think that if you had a moratorium declared on that silly locution, as minor as it is, I think that would have an impact, and I think it would get reported. And I think that people would feel, oh, things are improving with Iran. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
We'll get our first ambassador, who's been resident in both Tehran and Isfahan, to come and share his perspectives on where we are at the moment. Ambassador Miller.
Sorry. Time frames. I first went to Iran in 1959. This was after the coup d'etat of 1953 and the beginnings of a argument about who should rule Iran. It was an argument that was central to a generation that was transforming the country economically. This generation received its education in many respects from the best universities in the world, including its own. The oil revenues were beginning to have an effect on constructing an infrastructure for the country. there was a new sense of national identity being formed. Among my friends, the people of my generation in Iran, the arguments were, what kind of model shall we follow when we take over? The Chinese model, the Indian model, the American model, and of course the Tudeh spoke about the Soviet model. This is because Iran was in the midst of a continuing revolution, which continues to this day. The political equilibrium of Iran has not yet been reached. However, the revolutionary ideals have been developed over the past 110 years. What are those ideals? And they're important to look at, particularly now, when Iran is on the brink of restoring relations with not only the United States, but Western Europe. It is on the brink of coming out of isolation, an isolation that began with the overthrow of the Shah in 1978 and 9. There is a chance that Iran, like the United States, will cease to be hostages to each other. There is a chance that the high civilization of Iran will have a chance to flourish fully. The expression of aspirations. I can recall meetings, dinners in Iran where poetry would be recited as a normal event. But when I was there, it was political poetry. In 1964, for example, an anthology was published, an anthology of free verse. This was formally a new kind of poetry, that is, the stanza forms and the rhymes of the past were no longer followed. And there are new subjects, and the subjects were about the suffering and difficulties of the people. One evening I recall vividly, there was a recitation of Ferdowsi's Aresh the Archer, Aresh Kamangir. And Siavush Khosrawi was a free poet of that time, and he gave a modern version of Aresh Kamangir, and everyone knew the poem and felt it in their hearts. They were looking clearly for a new system of government, a new way of expression, a new dignity, a new national identity. The complication of a society within a society of so many thousands of years of duration emerge in times of crisis. Certainly, Iran has been in a crisis mode for my lifetime. In 1953, a democratically elected ruler was overthrown by the United States, the model of the democratic society that Mossadegh sought to develop. The ideal was shattered, and the search for a new ideal had to come from within. And it has come from within. And the result is what we see now. A very complicated society, both secular and religious. A government system which is both secular and religious. Highly competent in the world of technology, with great resources. It has every reason to believe that the new national identity will be a model for much of the world and an example of the best in its cultural life and history. When the hostages were taken in 1979, this was the beginning of the common use of words like sanctions, retribution, revenge, the hostage syndrome reflected the reality that both the United States and Iran had become hostage to each other. The word hostage goes back to the 12th century in English. Here, in its original meaning, it meant a pledge, not simply a taking of captives. In fact, hostages could also be friends. We have put ourselves in that condition, and the pledge, in a way, was the national identity of both countries. It certainly was the taking of American diplomats. In return, Iran was placed in a sanctioned mode as an enemy. There is a chance now to break through, to have a settlement. And I believe that the beginnings that were made as early as the first months after the taking of the hostages. The beginnings that were made in the end of the Iran-Iraq War can have fruition now. The agreement that's possible between the United States and Iran first is in the nuclear area. Iran has the capability of building nuclear weapons. There's no question about that. The technology and the brain power is there. The components could be put together should Iran decide to do so rather quickly. However, Iran has decided not to build nuclear weapons. There are no nuclear weapons, and there's a framework for serious discussion now, which is based on the proposition that is reflected in the religious statement made in the fatwa of both Khomeini and Khamenei, that weapons of mass destruction are forbidden by Islam, and Iran will have no nuclear weapons, has no nuclear weapons, and will not disseminate or produce any. We should seize that declaration and make it a reality by active diplomacy. There are a number of diplomats in this room. Johnny Pico was a part of a very successful outcome ending a terrible 10-year war. The capability of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Iran is unusual. This is a person who knows the nuclear equation perhaps better than anyone else in Iran, and he knows it as well as almost anyone else in the world. Our Secretary of State is well versed in these matters as well. The agreement based on an acceptance of the idea, the framework, that Iran will not be a nuclear weapon state and only use its enriched uranium for peaceful purposes is the basis for an agreement. The IAEA requirements for inspection and monitoring have been worked out over 10 years of experience. What is missing is the will on both sides to begin. The P5+1 has been underway for over 10 years. It has not produced a result. And the reason it hasn't is because they haven't addressed the fundamental issues of what an agreement would constitute. The deal is a very good one. No nuclear weapons, the lifting of sanctions, verifiable inspection, and the resumption of normal, civilized life between our countries. There's no reason why Iranian students shouldn't once again come in the numbers that they came to the United States in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It was the #1 nation. And it produced brilliant results in Iran. And is the basis of what should be a sound relationship between our countries. My very good friend, Bruce Langan, who was chargé in Tehran when the hostages were taken, spoke just a few days ago at a conference on this very subject. And he said, and I think this is a bellwether, let's get on with it. 34 years of being hostage to each other should end. We who were captive and our captors now understand that we should once again become friends. So get on with the negotiations. Work on what can be achieved. Open the gates to exchanges on all levels. Free the diplomats to talk to each other. Allow the diplomats to come to Washington and anywhere else in the United States. Talk to the counterparts throughout the world. Let's get on with it. I think Obama wants to have an agreement. And with the team he has in place now, with Kerry and Hagel, I think he can achieve it, and we will see significant progress this year.
Thank you. Now we're going to go to Ambassador Hunter, who of course is ambassador to NATO as well as a whole spectrum of different things you can see in his book and hear his perspective.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The problem with going last is everything's already been said. As they once said about a series of speeches in the United States Senate, somebody said, hasn't everything been said? I said, yes, but not everybody said it yet. First, I want to say I'm delighted to see some people here from the Iranian mission. After all, they damn well better be here because Houshang Amirati may be president next year. And you never know what's going to happen. One of the remarkable things is here's somebody can go from the United States to Iran, declare himself a president, and come home again. That has to say something. He didn't get thrown into Evin prison and is able to speak his mind. And I think we need to think carefully about that. Now, we are all preoccupied today with what's going on in Boston. The terrible thing that happened there on Patriots' Day, the slaughter of innocents, the crippling of a large number of people. One of the remarkable things that happens is when an incident takes place like this in our country ever since 9/11, is we go into a cottage industry. Who did it? I heard a lot of candidates for that, just like at the time of the Oklahoma City bombing, for the first few hours, we were given a whole raft of people. It was the Iranians, it was the Saudis, it was Osama bin Laden, blah, 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 blah. Nobody said it was going to be a homegrown American. Maybe some people came up with the idea, assuming that that is exactly, it comes out to be the truth, that it was a couple of people from Chechnya, born in, or from Dagestan, or from Kyrgyzstan. But I did hear on the radio somebody yesterday saying this could very well have been the Iranians. Well, I happen to think that was dumb, only because I don't think the Iranians are that dumb to do something like that. But I can tell you, if it had been brought home to the Iranians, or somebody would have said that, any idea about having any negotiation with Iran, we did, and the bombs would start falling. We are on that kind of hair trigger, and we have an industry here now, in the United States media, to a great extent in the Congress and others, who are prepared to seize upon certain kinds of events since 9/11 and point to their particular enemy and then work on that basis. That is a problem for our society, and it doesn't look like it's going to get better anytime soon. Incidentally, if they were indeed from Chechnya, they would have been, if they were Muslim, they would have been Sunnis, not Shia. A distinction in this country that is not well known. And I guess there's some really black humor with regard to that. I'm delighted to be with our two candidates here. Not two candidates, I'm sorry, one candidate, two colleagues here with their very extensive experience. I have to tell at least a couple of anecdotes of my own. Back in 1978, a colleague of mine, I was in charge of Middle East affairs in the White House, and my colleague Gary Sick was in charge of Iranian affairs. Fortunately, he had to deal with the hostage crisis, and I got to deal with the simple things like Arab-Israeli peacemaking. We were authorized by the President of the United States to offer the ambassadorship of the United States to Iran. We went out and offered it to this man, and he pondered about it, and he says, I don't think I'll do it. And as a result, Bill Miller did not become a hostage. He was free to stay in the United States. One of his smarter decisions. I went to, last time I was in Iran, I have to say, I haven't been invited since, but maybe there's a reason for that. I was in 1975 with Ted Kennedy, and we spent an hour and 47 minutes with the Shah. I think it was the longest meeting he'd ever had with a foreigner. We came out of that, and Kennedy says to me, he said, you know, this guy's got a lot of money. How come his suit looked like it was falling off him? And I said the following thing, and didn't follow up what I said. Oh, I don't know. Looks like a guy who's on chemotherapy. Oh! 5 years later, when we discovered, just as he was dying, that was true, we learned that his French doctors knew about it all along, but hadn't bothered telling us. The French are always very good allies. I happen to think that's true. Incidentally, talking about death to this and death to that, borrowing from the Persians, we do that. Anybody who's a chess player here does it all the time. Death to, checkmate, death to the Shah, right? That's what checkmate means. Okay, we're asked to talk today a little bit about U.S.-Iran direct talks as a breakthrough on the horizon. I hope that Bill Miller's right. I fear that he's wrong. Not because we don't have a basis, a framework, things to talk about, series of common interests, ways to make this work, but because the political climate, in my judgment, simply does not allow it. I'll give you another thing. I've worked on Arab-Israeli affairs now for 45 years with some of the same people. Lauren McCall's first cousin, for example, is president of Israel. That's Shimon Peres. You didn't know that, did you? Small world. Okay, well, he was in the game when I first started 45 years ago. There is a solution to Arab-Israeli peacemaking. It is called the Clinton Parameters of the 10th of January, 2001. Everybody who's honest, who knows anything about Arab-Israeli peacemaking, knows that that's the answer. So we've known it for 12 years. What prevents it from happening? Politics. Politics in Israel, politics among the Palestinians, and politics in this country. If you allow the Israelis and the Palestinians to get together, all the polling says they would agree on the Clinton parameters in 24 hours, and we'd have it done. Well, that's what's happening now, I'm afraid, with us with regard to Iran. We got a mess. And let's understand just how much of a mess we are in. In Iran, I haven't been, as I said, since 1975, but the people of Iran are suffering. No question about it. Not so much the leaders, but the average Iranian. It is a society that is highly isolated. The opportunities of this extraordinary society, our president says it, other people say it, etc., this extraordinary society to take its proper place in the world is stunted. The opportunity of people to go about their business and to fulfill their destiny as human beings is stunted. We've already heard that the largest group of outside students in this country up until 1979 were Iranian. Today, incidentally, they're Chinese, so maybe there's a story there too, unless we get ourselves into a real catfight with the Chinese. The Iranians are very much suffering. The United States, we're in a mess too. Let me just give it to you very simply. The President of the United States has made a commitment. Incidentally, if the President of the United States had been a Republican, he made a similar commitment. Both of these candidates were blackmailed during the election. I'm sorry, let's use the term, and they both caved into it, to say not only are all options on the table, incidentally, not all options are on the table. That is, we have not been prepared as a country to negotiate seriously, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But on the military side, the President of the United States, it's Mr. Obama, could have been Mr. Romney, have said that if X, Y, or Z comes about, some kind of red line, which is not defined very clearly. In fact, Mr. Netanyahu even said that caricature he had at the UN has now been kind of pushed up a little bit, in part because they have to understand in Israel that a war with Iran would be a disaster for Israel, just as it would be probably worse for us than the Iraq War has proved to be for us, from which we have still not recovered in the Middle East and with our alliances. I won't say that we in Iran are both self-deterred, but there is certain element of that in that. But the President of the United States has said that under certain kind of circumstances he would be prepared to use force. Now, this means the United States is in the following position, that the President is dependent on not having to follow that scenario, which I personally believe would be bad for the United States, and we can judge that. There have been a lot of people who have had their own views on it. I don't think it would be very bad. The President thinks it would be bad. The Joint Chiefs of Staff think it would be bad. Between them, they have so far managed to keep us from going over that particular line. But keeping from going over that line is dependent upon two things. One, Israel behaves itself. Two, Iran behaves itself. No great power should ever get itself into that position. It is, I won't say hair trigger, because I think there are a lot of sensible people on both sides who don't want this to happen and all of this, but it is not a salubrious position in which to be. And I think this is a mess, we've got to find a way to get out of it. Number one, I think what we have to understand in this country is we're not going to be able to disengage from the Middle East. We are sick and tired of war as people in this country. We had some people, idiot people, talk about a war of choice in Afghanistan. Sure, doing what we did, we all felt after 9/11 what we had to do. I worked at the time in a place called the Rand Corporation, and I looked out my window and I could see a plane slamming into the Pentagon. We're the first building south of that. In fact, I used to say I had a very unique position, very important position. I had oversight of the Pentagon. I literally had oversight of the Pentagon. Don't anymore, I now work someplace else. All right, we went into Afghanistan, and then at Tora Bora, we didn't get Osama bin Laden, and we have spent $1 trillion, or $2 trillion, in Afghanistan. There's not a war of choice. We could have stopped at that point. Then we went into Iraq, and one of the dumbest things we've done in our history, maybe there was some, not joining the League of Nations was stupider, I don't know, but certainly invading Iraq was another thing that cost us an incredible amount of money, and we've lost about 6,000 lives, on top of which we killed more than 100,000 Iraqis on top of that. People, we don't want another war out there, but we can't disengage. We're stuck with it. We have a lot of interests out there. We're going to produce more hydrocarbons in this country. We're going to have fracking. We're going to have a Keystone pipeline, whatever it is. We might actually become exporters. Stop. All of our friends and allies in Europe and elsewhere are going to continue to be dependent on hydrocarbons from the Middle East, and that's our economy too. So that's a pipe dream, the idea we're going to be able to get out. We also have, let's face it, a special relationship with Israel, which goes very deep in this country. It's not just something for Jews or for evangelical Christians. It is something that's very deep in our society. So anybody who's worried about that, get over it. It's part of the American culture, and let's move from there. We also are now facing a thing called Arab Spring, whatever that is. But it does mean that the capacity of dealing with things like terrorism, things like of kinds of instability, the refugee and immigration flow into Europe, et cetera, what happens in Egypt, or what happens in the Egyptian-Israeli relationship, what happens in Syria, with the risk now of a spread of a Sunni-Shia civil war in Syria across the Middle East. We have now a creeping civil war that is not something that's actually coming out of Iran particularly. The Iranian Revolution, to a great extent, has run its course. They tried to export the revolution, and people said, I don't want to live like that. It's also almost, I think Bill Miller was saying, really coming out the other side, but a lot of these others haven't. Now I'm going to say something that will get me in deep trouble, which is the leading exporter of terrorism in the world is not Iran, it's Saudi Arabia. Not the government, but all these rich guys who are like producing the Salafis and the whatever they're called, and have been killing Americans in great numbers. In Pakistan, in Afghanistan. It all comes out of Saudi Arabia. Now, it's not just a coincidence that 19 of the 20 bombers in this city happen to be Saudis. Well, we don't even talk about that. Well, you now have, in Syria, people saying, by God, you've now got Al-Qaeda working in Syria. Surprise, surprise. Well, we're going to be stuck there for a long time, and lots of folks are looking at us to do that. We don't need, therefore, this conflict with Iran if we can get out of it. Now, I'm going to part company with a lot of people. I don't think the nuclear thing is the big part of the issue, the biggest part of the issue. Could we live with an Iranian bomb? I don't want to live with it. And I can think of 100 reasons why not, but if need be, we probably could. The idea that the Iranians are going to be nuts, or frankly that Kim, whatever the guy's name is now, is nuts, and they're going to start popping nuclear weapons all over and seeing their country incinerated. The use of a nuclear weapon by Iran would mean the incineration of people of Iraq. They're not going to do that. That's dumb. And I hope they're smart enough not even to get across somebody's red line. I think I could sit down as a trained nuclear strategist, and there are 2 or 3 others in this room, and meet with some Iranians, but you can't do it because we're Americans. But get some Swiss. Please, you people in Iran, get some Swiss. Get some others. Get the South Africans who had the weapon and gave them up. The Swedes who decided not to. And sit down and figure out it's a white elephant to have nuclear weapons, particularly in that part of the world, and the Iranians would regret it. Now, there's a counter-argument, which is Gaddafi came to that conclusion, gave up nuclear weapons, and he got killed. That's not a great object lesson if you want to keep the Iranians from getting the bomb, quite frankly, but that's something they have to work out. Oh, one other thing, before I turn to what we need to do, something the Iranians need to do. Get off this business with Israel. Iran has no standing in regard to the Palestinian issue. I know they say things like, if the Palestinians reach agreement X, we will live with it. But all this stuff about Israel's this, Israel's that, the Holocaust this, the Holocaust that, I can see that maybe that's just domestic politics. But by God, that is raising a red flag. And every time it happens, American politicians cannot move in the direction of trying to have a serious interchange with Iran. That is a fact. And until Iran decides, we're going to stop that. We're going to shut people up when they start doing that. Shut them up. And now I can understand they would say, oh, Israel should be wiped off the map. Well, you can say what they're saying is, let's go back to 1947, start with the 47 thing and have a referendum. Well, if I'm an Israeli that says, well, the referendum, we lose the referendum, we cease to exist as a state, that means wiped off the map. Okay. Get over it. Okay? Stop it. Now, just so that I don't look like I'm being nasty to the Iranians on that, there's some things we shouldn't do. We did something last week which is an extraordinarily stupid thing to have done. We permitted the Mujahideen-e-Khalq. Incidentally, today is the anniversary of Waco with the Branch Davidians. The Branch Davidians looked like a Sunday school compared to the MNK. All right? The MNK came up with a huge amount of money, bought a lot of people, got themselves off the terror list. I don't know where the money came from. I'd really like to know where that money came from. Last week, they opened an office in Washington with a stone's throw from the White House and some people who should have known better. Ted Kennedy's younger son, Patrick Kennedy, Jim Jones, and Jim Jones shows up. Maybe he felt bad because on his watch, the Iraqis went in and killed a bunch of MEK people. He turned out and he said, these people share American values. This is a guy, he was National Security Advisor. That was, I mean, he took $25,000 from the MEK, but I don't think, well, I'm sorry. There was a poll that came out yesterday of Iranian Americans. The only thing they agreed on, 95%, is the MEK are a bunch of swine who worked for Saddam Hussein in the war that killed 1 million Iranians. Okay? That's really dumb on our part. Okay, we'll get rid of the MEK if you shut up, you Iranians who are in the room, shut up about Israel. Now, what do? I said that, and we're going to have a lot of discussion. First, we need to see this more broadly. We need to see what our interests are until some dumb bitch who decided he wanted to make a name for himself, came up with a thing called the Axis of Evil. We know why he came up with it. Up until that moment, Iran and the United States had a common interest in Afghanistan. Why? It's not because the Iranians loved us. Just like when the Iranians impounded the Iraqi Air Force in 1980 during Desert Storm, it's not because they loved us, it's because we had a common enemy. The Iranians and we worked together. Jim Dobbins and other people say that. Axis of Evil comes to an end. We have similar interests with Iran in regard to Afghanistan. We have certainly congruent interests with Iran in regard to drugs. The two countries that suffer most from drugs from Afghanistan are Russia and Iran. When I was in Afghanistan with Jim Jones, back before he discovered the MEK a few years ago, the Iranians came to NATO and said, we are suffering from the drug trade. Please, NATO, put your troops on the Iranian frontier in Afghanistan. The United States vetoed it. We all know why the United States vetoed it. All right, that's another element, but we also in the process have to get control of this issue made back here in the United States. Because I'll tell you, Israel, if it were to go to war or lead us to go to war with Iran, wouldn't be doing itself any favor, as we hear from 4 of the last 6 or 7 heads of Mossad, and we hear from many of the most recent heads of the Israeli Defense Forces. We've got to find a way to do that. We've got to get the United States Congress out of this business. John Kerry at least went up there yesterday and said, pretty please, don't do so much on more sanctions. Let's face it, we and Iran are at war. Sanctions are an act of war. That's our side. The Iranians have done certain kinds of things, whether it's with Hezbollah or Hamas, or what they may or may have not have done in Iraq or in Afghanistan, etc., etc., etc. These are acts of war on both sides. We ought to flip that around and start looking for acts of peace. And I'll give you some examples. Height of the Cold War, 1972, ABM Treaty. We created an incidents at sea agreement with the Soviet Union to prevent conflicts coming by a clash between our two navies. We and the Iranians, everybody has an interest in the free flow of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Everybody, including the Iranians. We have common interest on counter-piracy. The Iranians are involved in counter-piracy off the East Coast. Why don't we talk to them about it? Why don't we have an incident? Why don't we have a free flow, a freedom of passage through the Strait of Hormuz, etc.? Now, I said something, we don't have all options on the table. What we need to do is the following couple of things. I'll just finish on these things. Number one, if you want to deal with another country and get them to do something, you've got to walk in their shoes. The Iranians got to walk in our shoes, which means you've got to understand the Israeli thing for us and stop throwing gasoline on that fire. Like it or not. We have to understand that 3 countries, we have to recognize the security interests of 3 countries: the United States, Israel, and Iran. We are unwilling, and have been in 3 administrations, unwilling to say that we will recognize that Iran has legitimate security interests. Beg your pardon, Bill, but the report that came out this week by the team that you were involved with doesn't say that either. It says maybe down the road can be talked about. I remember talking to some of the EU negotiators a few years ago, and I made this point, and they said, oh no, we talked to the Iranians directly, and we said, we're prepared to have security, maybe security guarantees. Question, are you speaking for the United States? Answer, no. Then you are not serious. Now, maybe we can get a response, but if you're not prepared to say that, you're not even in the game. The Cold War with the Soviet Union came to an end for a number of reasons. One of which was after 1962 with mutual assured destruction, after 1972 with the ABM Treaty, we and the Russians became responsible for one another's ultimate security. That's what mutual assured destruction meant. Now, I don't think we were in that situation with Iran. They don't have mutual assured destruction against us, though they could cause us a lot of damage. And we could incinerate Iran if it came to that. We are in something of a mutual deterrent situation. Let's recognize it. Let's at least say security has to be an element. You know, if I were an Iranian, and I'm not, and I looked out at the world and I saw that I'm totally surrounded by nuclear powers. I have two countries, the most powerful country in the world and the second most powerful country in the world, that's a joke, the United States and Israel, have said, I'll attack you under certain circumstances. What would I do? I get the bomb. The miracle is they haven't gotten the bomb. Well, let's start looking at broader things. Let's look at our overall interests and do a couple more things, and I'll shut up on this thing. Number one, the United States government finally has to understand that the Middle East all has to be seen as a unit interacting, and they have to hire people who understand that, get a first-class team of people. Maybe Mr. Kerry and Mr. Hagel are, but if you go and you look at the people running across the United States government in charge of Middle East affairs, you would be shocked at how many second-rate and third-rate people are doing that. And that includes the entire White House team. Speaking as an American, that is shocking. Well, that's the way we're going to get out of this mess, and we damn well better do it, because otherwise we're going to wake up one morning, there's going to be a war between Iran and somebody else, and we're going to say, why didn't we avoid it?
Well, thank you. I think the three presenters have been a little short of superb with their respective perspectives on this unique challenge, situation, moment in time that we have. Let's have some questions, and when you have a question, let's pick the individual you'd like to.
Good evening. My name is Professor Ghassan Ali. I'm from Central Connecticut State University. I have a question for Ambassador Hunter. Two things. First, what I agree with you on, which is we need to hire people that know what they're doing. I think that's a given. And I agree that we don't in the Middle East. Second, on the Israel thing, I wish it is that simple to get off the Israel thing. But Israel is in the heart of the Middle Eastern problem. You can't get off the Israel thing that easily. Okay, you have to look at Hezbollah, how Hezbollah was established, basically as a result of the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, and the link between the Lebanese Shia and the Iranian government, and the role that Iran is trying to play in the Middle East as a key regional power to help what they believe to be oppressed people. And the people in southern Lebanon have suffered a lot as a result of the Israeli occupation. So we cannot just dismiss Israel like that. And as far as the war that was going on, it's Israel and the United States who are waging war on Iran. Who is killing the scientists there? Who is sabotaging the computer systems in Iran? We are waging cyber war in Iran, and we have to recognize that.
Well, I think that's a comment I don't respond to.
Well, how can we dismiss Israel, the Israeli thing, as if it doesn't matter? It does matter. I think it's the crux of the problem.
Well, I think I did say it mattered. I think we have continuing need to do what we can to try to bring peace between Israel and the Palestinians. It's not made easy at this point because of a number of problems. On the one hand, as long as the Palestinians cannot find a way of working between the West Bank and Gaza, which has a lot to do with Gaza being in its imposed isolation. And as long as you have a situation in Syria where the Israelis do not have confidence that the agreement they reached with the Assad family back in 1974 will hold, where they can't have confidence of what is going to, whether the treaty with Egypt will hold, though I believe it will, because the Egyptians have no interest in getting back to where they were before 1979. And as long as the situation with Iran remains as it is, as we've been talking about, in which the Iranians, quite frankly, don't make it any easier. That's what I was trying to say, that this isn't just, if only America would do this, or only Israel would do that. There are responsibilities on the Iranian side. And number one, to be very candid, if we ever manage to get out of this, the relationship between Tehran and Jerusalem is going to be more important than the relationship between Tehran and Washington. And I hope talks, covert, etc., are already going on. I hope so. They always used to in the past.
Yes.
If I may, since somebody of you mentioned my name earlier, I thought I would take the liberty of mentioning a couple of things. I've had probably 30 years of interfacing with Iran since the beginning of the revolution, and some interfacing was even too close to comfort, as some of you may know. What is in the old story of the last 30 years, which I mentioned, I found very curious. One is that, to the best of my knowledge, and my knowledge is limited, as you know, Iran, as the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the West, mainly 90% the US, have had so far, to my counting, 12 set of negotiations on different issues. 12. In many of them I was frontally involved, in others I was marginally involved, in others I was mentioned about it by the Americans and the Iranians who were involved directly. So 12 set of negotiations. I'd like to challenge all of you here. Of these 12 negotiations that I know of, I'm sure there are many more because I don't know everything. You know how many were actually successful? 11. 11, completely successful for us, by the way. And it had been also successful from the other side because they were accepted. This dimension has never been recalled by anybody because it is perhaps inconvenient. But then there is another dimension which bothers me in a way. It is more part of what I call the narrative. You and I know that unless we enter the individual narrative of the people we are talking to, there is no way of negotiating with Iran. That's only an idiot can say that. There is a way of negotiating with the person that is in front of you from Iran at that moment in time. And we know this because I psychoanalyzed myself for 60 years. I know how it works. You talk to me as if I was an Italian because my name is Italian. You never come through to me. I'm a son of the Iron Curtain. I was born within seeing distance of the Iron Curtain. Psychologically, that was the way when I was a child I was born. My narrative remains there. If you don't get that, I don't really care what is about Rome, the capital I never lived in, I never frequent, I don't even know what they are, and there's nothing to share with me. With the Iranian side, I had a good fortune of negotiating face-to-face with Rafsanjani, as some of you know, and face-to-face, and this many less people will know, with Khatami. Now, President Rafsanjani was great fun to negotiate with. Why? Because he is a very astute merchant. It's not a pejorative, it's a wonderful, as long as you know what is his stake. You could not have negotiated with President Khatami if you were not a little bit familiar with Locke and Hume, Descartes and Hegel, and to the merit of President Khatami, if you did not know the philosophy of a not-so-famous Islamic personage by the name of Henry Kissinger. We reached an agreement on a suggestion that he put forward, citing Henry Kissinger in 1975 with the Vietnamese. That is what the narrative is. That would have. Now, we have 12 negotiations that I can report to you in writing. In fact, they will appear in my next book in London at the end during the summer, listed one by one. Imagine the more ones that existed, I don't know. How can I know this? After all, I'm just coming from the Eastern Alps. What do we know? There's no tribe, we don't know anything. But the other aspect which bothers me is on a different dimension which has never been used. Now, we all know about 53. I'm sorry, but even too much we know about 53, right? Why we in this country don't we mention 46 and 47? The Iranians know that in 1946 and 47, without the UK and US intervention, the Soviet Union would have kept the occupation of the northern part of Iran for a long time. So, a bit of propaganda, guys. It's a good propaganda because it's true. Did we do something about it? Did we ever mention something about it? You know, we never did. And this is, I think, a fundamental element. I mean, if I was in the Iranian, I would say, why don't we say, you know, we remember that the West did something in 46 that nobody else did. It's part of the story. So, the last thing, and sorry if I talk too much. The last point is the following, in my view. We've made a tremendous step forward. Thanks God, conflict resolution has gone from multilateralism to minilateralism. Yes, I worked a long time for the UN in the old times, but multilateralism cannot work in conflict resolution. It has not done anything for the last 20 years. Because everything we've done well in this world, in terms of conflict resolution of tensions, in the last 20 years, has been the result of minilateralism. Now, I was always a bit mad. Imagine, in 1996, I wrote a piece in London suggesting that the Security Council of the UN should be reduced to number 6, not enlarged to 15 or 20 or to 25 or 30, like somebody from a little country, the capital of which is Rome, was running around like a chicken without head, asking for. Conflict resolution is coming down to unilateral at best. So the road towards bilateral negotiation between Iran and the US is now a part of what is happening as the role of the wheel of history is rolling. Is that going that direction, not in the opposite? So I think it's going to come in that way. But for God's sake, let's look also at what has been achieved during those last 30 years in different ways between these two countries. And a bit of history, as I mentioned before to Professor Woody, may not be so bad. May not be so bad also in this country. I mean, I had a very good conversation with an Iranian in 2005, and this gentleman, who's remain unnamed for obvious reasons, as you will understand in a second, said to me, John, I don't understand. I don't understand how we can explain this to the Iranian population what has happened. Because if we are too explicit, we may get into trouble. What is the trouble? When the US went into Iraq, they allowed us to vindicate 1534, which of course we all know what it is, but I'm not so sure that if you walk in the streets there somebody would remember what it was. Of course, I'm very old, so I was there, so I remember. 1534, Suleiman I conquered Baghdad, and the Shias go majority to Persia, in a small group, as we know, to South Lebanon, and the Sunni take over. So now, this gentleman from Iran tells me, with your kind, very generous American government, you ask us no blood, no money, but you gave us back Baghdad. 1534. I said, wait a minute. We are now in the era of negotiating, of democracy. So you cannot say just because now we are taking over, that you can stay there forever. I said, you're right. So let me see if it's more calculation, he said. Well, okay, so after 1534, I think the same minority was in power for 5 centuries. We can change it to centuries. Now, this may seem to be a joke.
Let's get Ambassador Miller.
Right, this is a joke, but it's not a joke. I mean, there is a little bit, I think, time has come to have a little bit of reflection and say, every time you speak about US-Iran, it's always war. No, we have had very useful negotiation. They have worked. I mean, I know this on my skin, right? Am I alive? How many people have been blindfolded and taken hostage in Lebanon, in Beirut, to free American hostages? As far as I know, I was the only one. But I survived. Why? Because I made a deal with President Rafsanjani beforehand. Not that it doesn't, that excluded the deal I had to make with Hezbollah was another one, and then with Israel, and then with the Germans, and blah, blah. But they kept their word. And if I can tell you one thing to all of them, please, there is nothing worse than to be blindfolded, taken away, with no knowledge what you are, and locked up in the back of a car. Don't do it. That's not a good negotiating tactic. Thank you.
Johnny Pico, for those of you who don't know, was a major reason why the Iran-Iraq war ended. He played a major role in the negotiations by his skill and his patient work with his Iranian counterparts, who were also of outstanding skill. I think we have a critical mass now of people who could do the job if they were allowed to do it. Certainly the experience that we've had jointly over the past 35 years has produced a register of people who know each other. A perfect example is the present Foreign Minister of Iran, who knows the United States. He was a student here. He has a PhD in the physics of nuclear power plants from MIT. He has been in charge of the Iranian nuclear program. Is a major figure in Iranian politics. He has met with counterparts, technical and scientific counterparts. They know each other well, and they've discussed all of the parameters, all of the problems and issues that need to be resolved, and have come up with reasonable answers. So the terms of an agreement are not an issue. But what is an issue is what Bob pointed out, is the politics in both countries stand in the way. But this is where leaders show their mettle, their quality, and their courage. And this is the time for presidents and the leaders of countries to step up to the mark. And we can have peace, and we can have a constructive relationship created once again. We forget that the history of the U.S.-Iranian relationship over the last 200 years is one of mutual amity and success. The aberrations have destroyed those successes, but we can recreate the conditions where we are friends, colleagues, and can contribute to the well-being and culture of both of our countries. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. My question has to do with the viability of having an official American presence in Iran, irrespective of which way the nuclear negotiations go in the next couple of months and after the first round of the upcoming Iranian presidential elections. Do you believe it is viable and in the American interest to have actual American diplomats on the ground there, whether it's inside the Swiss embassy and the interest section or in another arrangement? Or do you think that's going to have to wait until the resolution of the P5+1 led nuclear negotiations?
Well, maybe I wasn't clear. I don't think anything should be held hostage to the resolution of the nuclear issue where it's in our interest to see things go forward. Otherwise, there are various people who have a veto, who don't want things to go forward. There are people, including the Saudis and others, who don't want to see a reconciliation of the United States with Iran. This is more than a nuclear issue, it's a competition for friendship and power and influence and everything else. My view is that it's always good to have American diplomats on the ground, a lot of courageous people incidentally. You talk about Chris Stevens getting killed in Benghazi. He knew what he was getting into. And in fact, since the Second World War, we have had more ambassadors killed abroad than we've had generals killed abroad. Now, this is a lot of courageous people. They're not the ones who want to have the fortresses built. That's done for American public consumption, so we don't have another hostage crisis and all that. Most of the people who are hostages want us to have positive relations with Iran, as Bruce Langan is one of the leaders on that, who is with Shahjeh. So I think it's very important if that could be worked out in a way that it wouldn't be somehow vetoed by the Iranians. Absolutely, let's do it.
Imagination, Ambassador.
Pardon?
Imagination is limited. There are
Yes.
different ways you can have somebody sitting in Tehran. Even if the ideas never tried so far.
Well, we do have an intersection in what, Abu Dhabi is it, or Dubai? I know
We could go to Geneva.
Incidentally, as far as I know, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, we are the only country in the world that refuses to talk to people unless we like them. Even the Israelis talk to everybody.
Yes, please.
My name's Bert Wise, and like Ambassador Miller, Ambassador Hunter, I've had a little experience in Congress. And I go to meetings not just on Iran, but on many, many other problems before America. And experts talk about all the things that need to be done. The main problem, which was alluded to a little, is the politics of the American people, not what diplomatic initiatives we can take or how we can maneuver with Israel and so forth. They're difficult, but the problem with Iran, but with many things. When I came up on the train today, I opened the newspaper and one headline said, "Members of Congress afraid to support too many hot buttons." Well, that's really what it's about. And so, in the words of a fairly famous Russian as to what is to be done, my question would be, beyond Bill talked about a courageous leader, it's a little hard for the president to turn around and say, I was wrong about Iran, we really can't have, I don't want to be in a bidding war with the Republicans to show I can be tougher. But concretely, with regard to changing the American people, it's going to be hard because they've been hearing all of this nonsense for a few years. What kinds of things could be done to educate them about our interest and our mutual interests of the kind Ambassador Hunter mentioned, and about their ignorance? I have to take one disagreement with Professor Bullock, who I respect a great deal, because since the movie Argo, I would say that every American over the age of 7 knows about the hostage crisis. And one thing I had suggested as a small possibility would be for the President of the United States not to make an apology to Iran for the overthrow of Mossadegh, but to appoint a commission that on its face, and in fact was neutral with experts like Professor Bullock, to compile a history of U.S. relationship with Iran, which would have to inevitably just happen to candidly discuss that. But I'd like to know what any of the speakers think could be done for the most important thing, which is to begin to change, educate, and change America's attitude so the members of Congress, those towers of courage, would feel they could support the right moves and didn't have to prevent Obama from taking the right moves.
Bert, you've raised the right set of questions.
Third rail question.
You have been witness to several efforts that have been successful and have addressed that particular kind of problem. Dealing with the Soviet Union, how did the Cold War end? I would say that it was the back and forth of all walks of life, all professions, including congressmen and senators, trips to the Soviet Union, seeing the reality, and hosting return visits here in the United States, in Washington and throughout the country. They met each other, dealt with each other, and eventually came to agreement on the wisdom of bringing what was a destructive Cold War to an end. The same happened with China. The communist Chinese threat was dominated by the Committee of the Million, the Chiang Kai-shek lobby. How did that get resolved? By visits of people from all walks of life, delegations from the House and the Senate, the staff, and eventually when it was clear that a majority of the Senate was in favor of opening relations to China, then Kissinger and Nixon went to China. But the preparatory work of having interchange on a human basis in all walks of life, professional, cultural, diplomatic, this all produced a result.
But Bill, what really turned, if I could just follow, what really turned American public opinion about, which up until Nixon's visit, the American people, polls were still viewing China as demonized. Nixon was able overnight almost to turn that around. Reagan could do that with Iran. The Democrats under Obama, and I rang doorbells for them, but their foreign policy has been dominated by one thing, which is to make sure that the Republicans could never again demonize them on national security as a big factor in the elections. And so the real question, again, is how to get the American, what could, given that problem, which is a huge one, what could the Congress or the President or the administration do to start undoing all the damage in terms of the American people, educate them enough about common interest or otherwise so they have a little running room to do all the things that you suggested and other people here.
Well, what I was suggesting was that Obama has a chance to present a success to the American people. Our enmity with Iran is largely based on the suggestion that they want to be a nuclear weapons state. If he can get an agreement with Iran, which I believe is quite possible, success is not a bad argument to use in politics. I've succeeded. I've Iran has no nuclear weapons, and we can prove it. And all of the other things that should go should take place as well. That is exchanges, the opening up education again, museum exhibits, films, exchange of religious leaders, all of life. Wrestling, soccer, and not to mention tourism.
Well,
I just want to add one thing I heard before you talk about it. In 2007, Columbia University hosted President Ahmadinejad, and we had an event that, as far as I can tell, was one of the most educational events in recent American history, because Americans got to see the actual ruler of Iran without being filtered through the New York Times, New York Post, or Fox News, or something like that. That event, I think, was a fiasco for both sides. I think the President of Columbia made a mark in the history of hospitality that will never be eclipsed. And I think that the opportunity that Mr. Ahmadinejad had to talk to the American people was completely squandered, despite the fact that I offered to write a speech. I decided then I shouldn't interfere so much, so I did not do so. Now I feel I should have. But what I would like to see, following what Bill said, is that the next president of Iran, when he comes to the General Assembly in the fall, not having yet had a chance to become an international pariah, I think he should be invited by someone to give a public address that is televised for the American people, and we can see what the face of a new Iranian chief executive is.
well, let me just add, sorry, to add a couple of words. Incidentally, when the President of Columbia did what he did, I said, I bet you Mr. Ahmadinejad contributed $100,000 to the Columbia Endowment so he'd make this speech to help him back at home. I mean, that was just amazing. Look, it is time for the Americans to get over the hostage crisis and for the Iranians to get over Mossadegh. Incidentally, the more people look at Mossadegh, the more people say he wasn't such a great guy. He was a tool of Tuda, he was a tool of the Soviet Union, he was not necessarily, there's a disagreement on this. Disagreement. All
The
right,
State Department didn't think so.
let's not get
They
into
lied.
we can debate that after. What I'm trying to get at, we got to get beyond that. But until we find a way to deal with the Israeli component of this, none of this back and forth is going to mean a damn thing, because the veto will continue to be there. Just as the veto was there on the invasion of Iraq.
The suggestion that was made by my good friend here,
Hello.
that when the new president is elected in Iran, that he should come to New York, and President Obama should go up to New York, shake his hand, and have tea and dinner together. That would be a start.
I'd love to see that.
There's a lady.
Thank you. I am neither a diplomat, nor a professor, nor an Iranian. I'm American, and I couldn't disagree more, with all respect, Ambassador Hunter, that
Can you come up where we can hear you? I'm sorry. I'm not terribly, I got a little hearing problem. Particularly if you're going to disagree with me.
Oh, I get you.
I disagree that Americans must maintain this special relationship with Israel, Israel, the Jewish people have their state now. This is what they have been working for 100 years and more. Throughout their history, the Jewish people have relied upon, from the time of Joseph until when they were in Poland, when they were in Spain, they relied on the leadership of another nation to protect them. Now they have their state. They have got to grow up and handle their own affairs. As an American, it is not our responsibility to support them. Our president has no obligation to them. He is the president of the American people, not of Israel. I was at a talk where Walter Mearsheimer were discussing their book, and I was back home in Cleveland, where I had lived with my Jewish friends, and the audience was packed with AIPAC leaders. And Walter Mearsheimer concluded their talk, as apparently they always did, with America's relationship with Israel should be the same as it is with any other nation with which it has interests. When it disagrees, it disagrees. And when it agrees, it agrees. And the howls that went up from that audience were enormous. As if Americans have got to be empowered to say, we no longer should be put down, called anti-Semites, called anti-Jews, because we don't agree with Israelis bulldozing Palestinian houses. We should be free to say that is against our interests as Americans. I don't think that American leaders should be telling Iranians that they should cool their jets when we are supporting something that is immoral. I'll stop.
Let me just make some comments without disagreeing with a word of what you said. Number one, Professor Walt, Professor Mearsheimer both have tenure. That's a serious point.
Absolutely.
I've been blacklisted by 3 NPR outlets because I opposed the invasion of Iraq. I'm blacklisted 10 years later, okay? And not just by them. I don't have tenure. Number one. Number two, I wasn't describing an ought, I was describing an is. The is that even though there's now a thing called J Street, etc., when AIPAC snaps its fingers, people fall into line. If I could be lighten it up a little bit. There are 3 lobbying groups in this country which carry the day. 2 are terrible and 1 is good. The 2 terrible ones are AIPAC and the NRA. The good one is AARP, because I don't
Please. Yes.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all the speakers, including the unscheduled one, for their comments. One of Ambassador Hunter mentioned that one of the requirements of a diplomat is to be able to put oneself in someone else's shoes and see the position from that perspective. There were 3 solid suggestions made as to what should the Iranians do in order to improve and reach this aim of this talk here, direct U.S.-Iranian negotiations. The first one was Professor Bullitt's remark that the next president of Iran should instruct his media and others in a position of influence to stop shouting down or death to America. The second one was Professor Thompson's that the Iranians should live with the idea of a special relationship between Israel and the U.S. And the last one, again by Professor Bullitt, that the Iranian president should come to the U.S. and give a substantive public talk. What I'd like to hear from any of the speakers, including the unscheduled one, is what is it that Iranians can do, what is it that Iran, or the government of Iran can do, either on track 1 or track 2 diplomacy that would advance this idea of direct Iran-US talks. So we're mostly talking about what the US should be doing to advance this goal. So what should the Iranians do in order to advance this direct US-Iranian concept?
They should do in our direction what we're doing in their direction. We would welcome a flood of films, of music, of poetry, certainly of pistachios, carpets, works of art, and come to the United States as students, as businessmen, as clerics, and as tourists.
Can I add something incidental to the pistachio issue? The tariff on pistachios is now 600% or something because of the California pistachio growers. That's another matter.
Exactly. Many of them are Iranian.
Many of them are Iranian expatriates? Okay.
Absolutely.
All right, look, one of the things Iran can do is make it absolutely safe for Americans to visit Iran and come back again. There are a lot of people,
You mean Iranian Americans?
no, ordinary Americans, and also Iranian Americans. A lot of people would like to go, but are not sure they'd be allowed out again. I'm sorry, that's a fact. You know, I know where I speak.
I think that might be also just an uncertainty created by our media, because Robin and I, my wife was here, and our daughter was at Oxford, spent a month in Iran just before the last election. And it's a great country, people are great. I think what we really need to all sort of do is go back to Professor Bullitt and say, we need to have a generational change where people are not hung up on problems, and we need to keep finding things that can unify us. I mean, we talk about ping pong in China, we figured out some way to deal with China, some way to deal with the Soviet Union, and I like wrestling, so.
Well, can I suggest 3 practical negotiations? 1, on incidents at sea, and related to that, free flow of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz, where everybody agrees on that. Number 2, the Iranians and Americans and others talking directly about the future of Afghanistan, and 3, about the limitation on drugs flowing from Afghanistan. Absolute common interest on the 3 of those, and a basis for negotiation. If you get into the third rail issue of the nuclear and make that the requirement of everything else, you're not going to get there. Because that introduces, among other things, an Israeli dimension which does not appear in the other dimension, the other elements.
One point on navigation in the Persian Gulf. The United States Navy and the Iranian Navy talk to each other on both of the roads. And there's an embryonic hotline which exists on maritime matters. So formalizing the agreement and actually having a telephone line into the White House would be a bad idea.
Imad, I believe you're going to wrap us up here.
Yeah. Sorry, is there a pressing question? Last minute?
If they're bigger than you are, you might be.
I know, I have no choice. Well, I want to first of all thank everybody for coming and our brilliant panelists that have educated us about Iran and some pessimism, but there is still some optimism about the future. As Mr. Pico said, we should have some imagination. And since we have a historian with us tonight, I decided that my ending, note, I would mention that U.S. and Iran relations do go back far to 1856, and not only did the Americans have a role in taking away Iran's, elected prime minister Mossadegh, but an American gave his life for Iran's constitutional revolution of 1906. And since American-Iranian Council is in Princeton, it's good to mention that Howard Baskerville, Howard Disney, is revered to this day in Iran. He's the one who fought alongside the revolutionaries of Iran so that we could have a constitution. And so let's keep that in mind as an American and give us like that. And I'll leave you with this quote that you mentioned. He said when he was fighting alongside, he said, the only difference between me and these people, the Iranians, is my place of birth. And this is not a big difference. And I think that's a starting point that we should acknowledge. And since we have to be ending on a positive note, I decided that I'll take a little of each speaker's comments and try to say this three pointers. Number one, we need mutual understanding. It's been 34 years of us not talking to each other. The media has demonized our country, the Iranians, and unfortunately the Americans are also not viewing them positively in Iran. But the Iranians make a distinction between government and people. And this is what is very important. I remember when I was at Columbia, at CEPA, we sent 25 students of Columbia University, master students, in the spring of 2010 to Iran. And it was brilliant. They came back, and I remember that we had no idea how welcome we would feel when we go to Iran. So first of all, I invite anybody who thinks that they want to go to Iran, speak to us. We are the American Iranian Council. We're small, but we have big dreams. And so there's ways for us to go to Iran, and this people-to-people diplomacy is important. If politics are in the way, it's because the politicians don't have the will and will not put the political capital in mind. We've got to make it easy for you. We've got to create the grounds for you. And for that, the easiest way is to start this conversation. Because that conversation changes the mindsets. It creates a new paradigm shift. And that is what we need in Washington. And hopefully that will also trickle down to our society and in Iran as well. And so I always say that there is an opening now. It was my mistake to pick this topic, by the way, for this title of this talk. But there is no better time when we have gentlemen like Secretary of State, Kerry, we have Secretary of Defense, Hale, we have Vice President Joe Biden, who've all spoken or been involved with the Council for years. We know they were friends with the Iranians. We know they want change. They want the relations to get better. And I think a president called Barack Hussein Obama, with a middle name like that, I mean, Hussein is revered. Imam Hussein, sometimes, when you say Imam Hussein, even if you are not a Muslim, if you're not a Shia, if you're not religious, in Iran during Karbala, you will beat your chest. So it is important that if we have these four incredible pillars in Washington, let's give them the chance, and Obama can be re-elected, which is good or bad. So I think you should take the risk. Come on. Because I've lived all my life in these two great countries at war at each other. They chose thrones. But this country has given me education, has given me my first love and my first heartbreak. And Iran has given me life. So it is time that we can push this forward. And hopefully we can all have a great time in Tehran, in the mountains of our lords, and we can ski a little bit and drink some tea. Thank you.